Hello, everybody. I'm here with Savannah Tate, again, my sister.
Wait, are we actually starting?
My soul, yeah.
No, okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
we're live. We're rolling, baby. I'm here again with my one and only podcast guest, Savannah Tate, who shall continue to be... No, David's going to come on soon, my brother, and we're going to talk about more kind of cultural, university, modern day, not so connected to writing stuff. But for now, I thought we'd take off, start off where we stopped last time. Not last time, on the first podcast episode. So we've had two. The first one, we sort of talked about Savannah as a writer, her journey, what first inspired her to write, how her vision for writing and for story has shifted or broadened or strengthened through the years. And we were just sort of getting into more of the specifics, probably the more interesting actual mechanics of her process and how she writes and how she views story. We were just sort of getting into that when we stopped. So that's podcast episode number 1, which if you have not seen it, you should probably start there, although this one will be fairly immediately useful as we dive in. And the last one had a lot of intro into Savannah, which is fascinating, absolutely.
But unnecessary.
But unnecessary if you're not one of her fans. So the second episode we talked about Rhythm of War, Brendan Sanderson's 4th book in the Stormlight Archive series, and we also got interrupted kind of abruptly there, but this one we thought we'd continue because for episode 1 we had left off with 3 questions, which were rather interesting questions, so I thought we'd start off there. And those were, we could probably tackle them, it'll probably take some time, it could take the whole time, but the first one was, how has your overall vision shifted through the years with regards to the importance of prose, the writing itself, sentence formation, vocabulary, versus other things. So we had been talking about how when we were younger, we would look through thesauruses and try to find all the most advanced words possible, and we would try to write very complex sentences, use a lot of words like spurious and mendacious, and we would try to probably impress the reader, and we were young. And now we've shifted very much. You've shifted very much to have a different focus. We've started appreciating, I would say, appreciating writers for different things, but also understanding that good writing itself is a slightly different thing than we had always thought.
Yeah.
So my first question was how your vision has shifted, how you've started to weigh perhaps more, and then what? How would you describe it? More than prose. Character, timing, simplicity, the eloquence and poetry that can come with simplicity, these things, how you shifted towards those, where you would still value prose. That was question 1. Question 2 was how the overall culture has shifted over the last century or so, the overall writing style. Why are the old classics, Dickens and Alexander Dumas and Ernest Hemingway and Tolkien, of course, why are these written in a more eloquent, maybe articulate, maybe archaic style? Where's the value of that, and where's the value of modern day? That's question 2. So we can start with those, and then the third one is your outlining process, but those are good to start. So long intro. What do you think?
So for the first question, I would say, in the past, I would focus a lot on the vocabulary, and I think this is, it makes sense. You're a kid, you're self-aware of the fact that, there's so many words you don't know, and you're reading these words in the stories and the works of fiction or nonfiction that you admire. And so you're trying to grasp, how do I get from where I am to being able to write something like that? And like the most obvious thing is, I need to know all these words, because that's what I'm seeing in these books that I'm reading and that I don't have. And I think it's tied very closely to what you said was actually the first thing that popped to my mind, is trying to impress the reader. Because I think, I know at least I had this a lot as a kid of trying to, nobody was reading my stuff. I hadn't spread it to anybody like, oh, read this. But I would always imagine, okay, when people do read this, I want them to be impressed with me. I want them to think, like, oh wow, like look at the words that this girl knows, at her age, and from starting from when I was, maybe 9 or something. And so I'd be in the thesaurus, like, oh, what's a synonym for this?
Yeah.
What's a synonym for this? Make it sound fancy. And I think, I know I definitely probably we both got in our early writing, kind of misguided on putting too much focus on the vocabulary and on all of that, and not focusing as much on the actual strategy of storytelling. And I'm differentiating like storytelling from writing for the moment.
Yes,
saying that,
definitely.
writing is just it's the prose. It's like,
Yes.
the sentences, the syntax, the grammar, and storytelling is actually, how do you present the story,
Yes.
the characterization, and
That's very key.
yeah.
And it's something that linguistically is good to differentiate. Sometimes we say story and prose. Sometimes we say story and writing.
Yeah.
But
And I think when you're young and you're trying to, self-teach yourself how to write, it's more complex to begin to understand the strategies for like storytelling than it is to simply see the words on the page and think like, oh, here's a word I don't know. Maybe I can use this. Maybe I can, what are synonyms? So I think that's the first thing we went to was we equated, good storytelling with, okay, it must have elaborate prose. And obviously now we realize, this isn't necessarily true. Storytelling and the writing are very different. And I've definitely shifted over the past, my whole evolution as a writer to seeing like, okay, if I can get anything right, first and foremost, I want to get the storytelling right. First, you have to have a good story. No matter how you tell it, you have to have a good story.
yeah.
But a lot of what makes a good story is indeed how you tell it,
Yes.
and the characters and how well you can get your audience to empathize with the characters or to feel alienated from the characters. That's a different type of storytelling, and that's good too. And their journeys, their evolution, their relationships with other characters, how you build the world, how you set the scene, how you work with surprise and suspense, all of these, how you really, take mastery of your audience's emotions. This is what matters the most. And I've definitely shifted my focus a lot to getting all of these elements in place and trying to make sure I have a sound foundation of the story, of the characters. And then I would definitely still say I'm definitely an advocate of the writing itself, the sentences, the sound of them, how they flow together. That still matters. Not as much. Like, you can have someone who writes very plainly, like Brandon Sanderson. His prose is very simple. He doesn't spare a lot of effort or like do a lot of revisions to make it something beautifully crafted. But a lot of his books I've still really enjoyed because they've had interesting stories, they've had good characters, I've liked the themes, and obviously a lot of other people have too.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, just
Yeah.
briefly. I remember when he was releasing, I think it was the beginning chapters of Oathbringer, I'm fairly sure. He was releasing like I think it was the rough draft, or like it wasn't the final polished product. He was releasing them on his website or something, or on Tor or wherever it was. And I remember reading through, and there was some paragraph about Kaladin like running across rock buds and they were crunching under his feet. And then like a few paragraphs down, he began the next a paragraph with the exact same like 2 sentences, like rock buds crunched under Kaladin's feet, and it was like the exact same. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. He's fine, putting this out. I think that's good. I admire it, and he's very obviously confident in the story he's able to tell.
Yeah.
And
where he's not self-conscious about.
Whatever process gave rise to that, he's comfortable and confident in that, and I think that's important. Anyway, that's sort of a separate thing, but it was just kind of funny to me.
Yeah.
But you were saying.
Yeah, I was saying, obviously you can have an author like Brandon Sanderson who doesn't put a lot of effort into the prose, and you can't say that's bad, like never do that. Not necessarily. Like if he doesn't want to take that time, if he doesn't want to put the focus on that, then, that's okay. Obviously, millions of people still enjoy his books,
Yeah.
and because he has a lot of other good elements. For me personally, I would never want to publish a book that I can't read and be pleased with the way that it sounds, you know, like, and this is why I think, as much as I enjoy Brandon Sanderson, I will always go back to authors like Patrick Rothfuss or even, yeah, and you know, there's so many different styles. There's so many different ways in which the prose can be pleasing. Patrick Rothfuss is, it's pretty simple still. You know, it's not complex. You don't have a ton of like long, intricate sentences and semicolons and, you know, high vocabulary. No, not really. But it's simple, but it's poetic, and the timing is really good, and it's clever. You have that style. You have one of my favorite books, A Thousand Splendid Suns, Khaled Hosseini, a different style. Also, you know, not super complex, but very evocative, very emotional, and very introspective in some ways, tackling, you know, the character's inner emotions in a very effective way to me. You know, there's different styles of how you want to make your prose beautiful. But no matter which one you pick, for me, like I said, I would definitely want to put the energy into doing that, because to me, yeah, maybe I can have a good story, I can have good characters, but the writing itself is also a part of the, you know, the work of art of writing a book. And it's kind of like, you know, you can have a painting that tells some story, or a tapestry or something, and you can be like, oh, that's a cool story, you know, but it's even better if it's a good painting, you know, and if it's really skilled in the actual details of the craft. And so to me, yeah, I've shifted my focus a lot from the actual mechanics of the writing, the vocabulary, the syntax, to more the storytelling. But I still see so much value in and so much beauty in having beautiful prose, not necessarily elaborate, not necessarily, you know, complicated. Sometimes it's more effective to have simple as opposed to complicated. But I still see the value in that. It's just not it's not priority over the storytelling.
Okay, that's a good answer. Definitely, I think that captures it fairly well. It captures pretty good. I mean, this is obviously something you could talk about for a really long time.
Yeah.
Like, we could go into tons of details about specifically what element or what dimension of wordy, you know, wordy is generally associated negatively, but what dimension of eloquent, articulate, elaborate, sophisticated prose is valuable, what is just taste, and what is actually detrimental, and then what element of the sort of simple or blunt, or, you know, there can be like these bluntly dramatic lines that are so powerful. And I would say, oh, that's great prose. Like, if it's too wordy, it pulls you out of the moment. You have to think about it. You have to appreciate the fine nuances of the words. And that's great for certain things. Like, it's pulling you out and saying, look at this. Imagine this moment or this emotion or this color in a way that people don't naturally, instinctively imagine it. And you're forced to think about it by nature of what's actually happening in the story. So to bring in more complicated words and more powerful words or versatile words for the purpose of describing that, it doesn't really detract you or jar you out of the story. Detract you. It doesn't really jar you out of the story any further. It more just serves the purpose of capturing exactly the uniqueness of this moment that is already something you'd have to think about. That was kind of a long description, but there can be times where the advanced words are great for that purpose, and then there can be times where the moment itself, the words the character's saying, or just the fact that the sword fell, you know, these things themselves are the shocking, dramatic, glorious, whatever moment. And so the simplest words, the most well-timed, dramatic, can be better. So that's something we could talk about, quite a bit. And if you wanted to go into more detail, we could. I would ask, also going back a little bit, it's kind of a tangent, but also kind of an integral link in this is maybe I would ask you to elaborate a little more exactly how you view this phenomenon where readers can be fully absorbed in the characters, fully absorbed in what's going on because of the story as a matter separate from the prose. I didn't phrase that right. But how would you further distinguish story and prose, or, storytelling and writing like you were talking about earlier? Talk a little more, I guess, about specific authors or specific examples of why can such simple prose, why can simple writing produce something that's so engaging, enthralling, that the reader feels fully drawn in. And does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Where I guess is the... I'm not phrasing it well. Elaborate more on that.
Yeah, well, I'd say...
like Rothfuss would be a great example.
Yeah.
We're always talking about Rothfuss.
Yeah, he's our favorite reference because, like I mentioned before, a lot of the prose of The Name of the Wind and The Wise Wind's Fear is pretty simple. Some parts are very poetic, some parts are very witty or clever, but, a lot of parts are simply, just basic prose. And to me, he still has a better feel for what sounds good than Sanderson, where even his basic sentences, there's a nice rhythm to them. They're pleasant to read. Whereas Sanderson, it can be more, he's just getting across the facts, the action, like, okay, this is what's actually happening. Yeah. And, Rothfuss, even in his simple sentences, maintains a little more, nice flavor to me. But like you were saying, we always like to talk about him because you feel so drawn into the story and to the character. Yeah. And
right. Sorry. That's something. Sorry. It was a ways back. And so I was trying to remember exactly why I had wanted to ask that question, and it ended up coming out sort of flat. But yes, as a reader, as a freelancer and with your years of experience interacting with readers and writers and sort of being the link between the two perspectives, and then as a reader in your own life and as a writer in your own life, talk about the experience of reading a book and why the prose in the end seems to occur to you so little. You seem to notice the prose so little if the story is good and engaging. A lot of times as a writer or as someone just analyzing prose from a clinical perspective, it's very easy to start thinking, okay, I need to write fancy, I need to write advanced. And I thought your description earlier of as we grow up, this is the first thing we become aware of that we don't have. Oh, I don't have this vocabulary. And you're not yet aware of the story elements that you don't have. And so, of course, you try to tackle those. But, talk about the experience of as a reader of reading a story that's engaging and finding that the prose pulls you right along. You're so fully absorbed that you don't even notice it. Talk about that, because a lot of times... our clients would be one example. A lot of times our clients don't fully grasp, how naturally the reader is already entrenched in the story. If the prose is smooth, if it isn't tedious, if it doesn't have too much extra fluff, if it doesn't explain things that the reader already knows, how it just pulls them forward in the story, and they don't even care about the prose. Albeit, if it's simple or whatever.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going with talking about Rothfuss.
Okay.
And The Name of the Wind is, I was talking about how a lot of it is pretty simple, but and this is something I'll notice sometimes the first time I pick up a book. Obviously, the first chapter, the first pages, you're not fully absorbed in the story yet. So for me, at least, I'm always more aware of the prose itself. And maybe the first couple pages, I'll be like, oh, like, I'm trying to remember if I had this response with Name of the Wind, because the fantasy books that I would read prior to Name of the Wind were a little bit older, maybe a little bit more elevated, like Tolkien or Terry Brooks or Robert Jordan. They're all a little more elevated. They're not as simple. So I think when I picked up Name of the Wind, my first reaction was like, oh, it's nice, it's poetic, it's a bit simple. Maybe I thought that in a slightly negative way. I don't exactly remember, because I know the opening, like the prologue to Name of the Wind it's definitely very creative.
Yeah.
And it's hard to have a negative response to that, I think. But the more you get into the story, you start to get pulled so much into the character and into his plight and, Quoth and first, I mean, you do have a long sequence with where, him as a man, the innkeeper, is kind of going about his day and, before he gets into actually telling his story as a boy. And it's pretty simple and everything. And you're like, okay, like what's going on? But you quickly become pulled in by the questions that Rothfuss starts to present of like, who is this man? Why has he changed his name? Why has he come to this town? And now he has this inn that the Waystone Inn. And then you get into him telling his boyhood story and you're like, okay, he was traveling, he was, his parents were part of a troupe, they were teaching him music, and then his parents die. And now he's all alone and he's having to survive. And you quickly become so pulled into his story and his indigence. He's penniless and he's always having to fight for food and for everything. Yeah. And, soon...
And it's all told very freshly, very emotionally. He portrays the emotions and the relationships in a very convincing, fresh way with all these, little details that are convincing.
Yeah, and that are unique, in a lot of fantasy stories you get the same stuff over again. You get like young boy and like finds a sword and like falls in with some mentor figure and not that that's a bad story necessarily, but a lot of books tell it the same way, with no new details or new perspectives to make you think like, oh, this is something different, and that's what Rothfuss does. Is he tells it from a different angle, in a different tone, telling details that are interesting because you haven't heard them before, and so even though in some ways the story is it's a classic fantasy story, young boy, parents are killed, has to go face the world. He makes you feel, to me, he makes me feel a lot closer to the character than other authors do. And this is why the writing itself, even though like it's simple in a lot of ways, that's okay. I'm not bothered the whole time by like, the sentences are kind of simple. Like, no, you're not thinking about that because you're pulled into the story so much that when something happens that Quoth as a character, should be afraid of. Like, as soon as it happens, you're afraid of it as the reader before Rothfuss even has to say that Quoth is afraid. Yes. Like, the character so well that like you have the same emotional reactions that he's going to have, and you're not just waiting for Rothfuss to tell you like Quoth was afraid, and then you're like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to be afraid. Like, no, you don't have to follow the cues. You feel close enough to the character because of Rothfuss's skill with storytelling and with really pulling you in and giving you the details that make you feel connected, that you don't have to like fabricate emotional responses in your mind of like, okay, this is a dangerous situation. Okay, be afraid. Yes. No, you already emotionally because you're close enough to the character. And so you don't, when you can get this mastery over your audience, it doesn't matter so much how exactly you're delivering every sentence,
And here we could probably go a little bit into your quote, which I always like, assume the intelligence of the reader. Because it's very kind of tightly enmeshed, I would say, with this is the fact that, common examples would be like using the word suddenly, or like, oh, he was filled with dread, or, my heart froze. Like, these sorts of things can be useful, but they are heavily, heavily overused because of what you're talking about, which is you're already fully absorbed in the character. Actually, involving too many kind of extraneous words tends to jar the reader out and be like, oh, suddenly something's going to happen, and then they're just already, the suspense is ruined. Whereas Rothfuss often just writes like, oh, it just happens.
Yeah. Yeah, and
so kind of assuming the intelligence of the reader, anyway.
Yeah, if you're too much, a lot of writers who are not confident about their mastery over their audience. I think they throw out a lot of these phrases in an effort to gain that mastery. Like I need to stimulate my audience to feel excitement, to feel fear, to feel whatever. So they'll throw out like, oh, like his heart was beating, so fast, his heart was racing in his chest, or like a cold sweat, blah blah blah. Like you can have these like recycled lines that you could probably find hundreds of in every fantasy book, and that doesn't mean they're all bad. Like I mean, Rothfuss uses them too. Sometimes very simple, very cliche, like a cold, I broke out in a cold sweat or something. And, sometimes it's fine. Sometimes if you try to, I remember one client I had, well, actually it was a joint client we both worked with who he thought the key to writing a good book, you already remember, he thought the key to writing a good book was to like never use any words that any author had used before, and never use them in the same combination. So like never say, his heart was racing in his chest, like never. You had to find some like really bizarre like simile, like his, inside his rib cage was like a horse race track and their hooves were like whatever, and you're like
thrashing wildly.
You're like, yeah, that's unique, but really what you did to the reader just then is you yanked them out of the scene, and now they're like horses racing hooves, what? And in moments like that, it's not always bad to say like his heart was racing in his chest. Not always bad. But a lot of writers who are not super confident, I think, just like they try to slap all these phrases down to like, be excited, come on, be excited. And that's just not always necessary. Like you said, sometimes the most effective thing is pull your readers in so well that they know everything. They know what's going on without you having to keep telling them like you have to be afraid because the character's family is in debt, and if they don't pay it off, then like they'll be taken off to jail. Like you don't need to keep repeating it because they already know it. They already fear it. And then you don't have to waste your words on sentences like, that are just kind of trite sentences. They're, suddenly this happened, or suddenly he felt whatever, like, because your reader is already feeling that way without you telling them. You can just go straight into the action of, whatever's happening, whatever actual event is moving the story forward, and let the story do the work by itself without having to like commentate for your audience on, this is what emotion is supposed to go with this.
Yeah. Well said. Definitely. And that goes hand in hand with the more uniquely, the more convincingly you can absorb the reader into the character, the more naturally or the more powerfully they are going to experience that effect, which is the natural, the emotions that naturally arise within the character are already naturally arising within the reader.
Exactly.
And exactly like you said. Yeah. So those things do tend to go hand in hand, and it is a balance as well, because like you said, Rothfuss, he says things uniquely, and he says unique things about a person, but they're still simply said, and they're still streamlined enough or momentum filled enough that they don't jar the reader out, and the reader's like, wait, why is he talking about, I don't know what an example would be. Like, okay, maybe an example could be Quoth's eyes. Like, people are always describing eyes. It's something I struggle with describing too much. Every reader, eyes are very powerful, face is very powerful. Eyes, face, tone, like these things. And you start to realize, like, wow, all the dialogue in this entire book is maybe he doesn't struggle with, not Rothfuss, but maybe this writer doesn't struggle with too many speech tags, but instead of speech tags, he just puts entirely descriptions of voice and tone and eyes and facial expression. And so that's something that can definitely be overused. And Rothfuss does a very good job of instead describing just what characters are doing, maybe. First of all, some authors do a good job of just putting the dialogue, and you can just picture it in your mind, because you know the argument that's going on.
Yeah, you know the tone that they're using. And that's another thing with dialogue, is that you should be able to write dialogue skillfully enough that you're not needing to tell
Yes.
every line like he said this angrily.
Yes.
He said he said this in a placating tone. He whatever
Yeah.
like the dialogue should be able to speak for itself in a lot
Yeah.
of ways.
No, exactly. I'm glad you said angrily, because that actually reminded me. I was going to say it's sort of just an extension of the classic thing they say of no adverbs, like oh, adverbs are bad. You should be able to convey it with the action that's already taking place. It's pretty much just an extension of that. These authors that just put dialogue with no description, no speech tags, nothing, you can already picture it. And oh man, what was I going to say before that? Oh, so or you can say what the characters are doing, and Rothfuss will say unique things, like they'll be whatever playing with like the beer that spilled onto their table, or they'll have unique things like Denna has unique characteristics like her ears, or certain things she'll do with her hair that are very much Denna. And so you can actually associate her emotions with those unique characteristics while learning more about her, while experiencing the story in a realistic, absorbing way, and not feeling like you're reading anything cliche or trite.
Yeah, and I think how you can come by a lot of these details, you gave the example of like, playing with the, whatever, the ring of condensation that your cup left on the table.
Yeah.
A lot of times if you're sitting at your computer, like, okay, like write this uniquely, it can be hard to think of like, because your mind automatically just goes to all the things you've read before, which are usually just cliche and you don't want to write them. But if you, I think, watch people in real life, if you go out and you watch the way people act, like you'll start to see all these idiosyncrasies of things that they do and characteristics about this. I mean, this can apply also to what you were saying about physical description, like the eyes, the face. A lot of authors are talking about, like she had, deep blue eyes and blah, blah, blah. And, that can be cool sometimes, but a lot of times, and, I used to do this when I was younger as well. I'm like, okay, I want to give my readers a picture of this character. And so I would always launch into, like, every time you met a character, I would like have a paragraph just describing their physical, like a slender nose and pencil thin eyebrows and high cheekbones. Like, and then you realize, like, if you read this in somebody else's book, within like, the next 3 or 4 pages, like you have no memory of what the character looks like because you really don't care.
Yeah.
You don't care what they look like. You care about who they are, how they act. And so, the same sort of thing you were saying about eliminating just like boring speech tags and, putting in something, either putting in nothing or putting in something more unique, can apply to physical description as well. Like who cares what their eyebrows are like?
Yeah.
Like, maybe if it's a movie, you care a bit more what they look like. But if it's a book, like no one is like, yeah, I always remember Aragorn's eyebrows, are so like,
at least no one
whatever.
I know.
And
I feel like I have heard people talk about like the physical descriptions.
I mean,
valuing them.
I think I'm not saying don't do them, but if you can do them,
I don't think you should
do them uniquely. Like I've started trying to eliminate like oh, he had shoulder length, wavy hair, blah. Unless
or just like over time, like characters.
Yeah,
take
exactly.
Shape over time.
That's one thing. Over time, mention, little characteristics about him, because you do want, your readers probably want to know what color their hair is eventually, or because they like to have an image in their mind. But when they first meet them, dumping a paragraph on them of like, this is his description isn't the most effective. Maybe if they have something unique about them, just mention that. Like if they have like, a hunchback or something, mention that, obviously, because that's going to stick in your reader's mind then, if like, oh yeah, this is the character with that. Or if, if they have like a prominent streak of gray in their hair, and maybe it's unique because they're only like 25 years old, and that's interesting. Your reader's like, okay, that's a curious little fact, and that's good.
Yeah. Let's see. I feel like several questions or lines of possible conversation came to me. And I lost them. There's just definitely so much. There's just so much ground we could cover here. I was going to say something about Quote's eyes, but I think we pretty much covered it. Just unique ways of expressing. Let's see. Where did we leave off? Should we go on to talk more about your approach to writing. That was sort of the vein of conversation in the first episode, which we are continuing. We could go back to talk about your how you have evolved with regards to characterization. We've been talking about characterization a lot here. How you've evolved maybe with your approach to dialogue, speech tags, all that sort of thing. How do you go about writing a conversation? How do you go about describing what your characters are doing? Do you think about it? Do you try to plan every intentional, little foreshadowing and hint uniquely? Or do you... But we could go into that, or we could keep talking about Rothfuss, or we could... Yeah, what do you think? Or we could go back to the story versus prose, writing, eloquence, art, advanced vocabulary.
Yeah, well, I mean, since we've gotten some into, like, now more specifics, more details of... maybe we should each talk about some of our thoughts on how we approach these things. We can go to the third question, maybe, and kind of segue into that, and then go back to the second one afterward.
Okay. You think, yeah, that would be good, because we could talk about outlining, and that leads sort of in from the general fundamental foundational broader process. We will sort of naturally arrive at the more specifics. Okay, so outlining.
Yeah, so
let's see. Yeah, what's a good way to go about this?
Well, I think you were asking me a moment ago how I approach, writing, dialogue, or like, do I plan everything out? Do I everything foreshadowing? Do I, and so, I mean, outlining is, I think, a constant evolutionary process for me, at least. I'm still trying to find how much I like to plan out ahead of time and how much I don't. I used to be very much like, oh no, like, I don't need to outline. I have it all in my head. And, I've talked to people who definitely have this approach and like, oh yeah, like, and like, it's almost as if they look down on outlining and like have a little bit of like, well, I don't need to because I have it all in my head. And I used to be kind of like this. And then I realized what I believe to be a truth, which is that you simply cannot keep everything in your head so organized. At least enough.
And I think you simply cannot just go with the flow.
Yeah,
utterly.
I think.
Anyway, yeah.
As in a lot of things in life, like, I think to be intentional has so many benefits, and I think if your story has any complexity, it is very difficult just to be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to write it off the top of my head. Like, maybe you can do that, but your first draft is going to be very simple and very full of mistakes because you're going to write one draft and you're going to look back and be like, oh, this is awful. I need to change so much, because by the end of the draft, you're going to have so many better ideas.
Yes.
And, this is what I think we both encountered with the first stories we tried to write, is we're like, yeah, like gung-ho, like I'm just writing the story, and you have some vast vision in your head. And then you write like a few hundred pages and you're like, wow, this is such a mess. And, maybe for me, like I did several revisions before I realized like, this is just not the way to go about this. And at that point, I was more closely analyzing books I would read, and if you read books like, I mean, Name of the Wind is not even a very complex book. There's only one POV character. But if you read a book like that, you do see that there's a lot of foreshadowing about things, and I doubt Rothfuss just sat down and was like, I'm going to write a story and like put in all this foreshadowing just off the top of his head. No, I think he planned it out. And if you read, like Game of Thrones, like I guarantee he planned it out. He just, Martin didn't just write that off the top of his head. And so many books that I admire, I realized that the benefit of outlining is you can, one, put in a lot of foreshadowing, which is, that can be really important. Not every book needs a ton of foreshadowing. It depends on the story you're trying to tell. But,
it is so cool, though.
But it's really cool, And
more broadly, just a character arc.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's
it's
where...
It's not necessarily foreshadowing, but it is just everything should be connected.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go next is, foreshadowing, you know, however much you want it. But aside from that, simply the story,
Yes.
you know, to keep you on track and focused on telling the story you want to tell and the character's journey that you want to tell, and being able to tie everything together in a way that's cohesive and doesn't just do what, you know, my original stories would do, which was just like wander everywhere. Like, oh, like I feel like talking about this now, and like I would go into a scene and it would just kind of play out however I was feeling in the moment. Oh, maybe, you know, they'll have this conversation, and then there'd be like a 4-page conversation that wasn't necessarily related to anything.
Yeah.
It was just like, I was like, maybe this is an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes
It's like, oh, I haven't had a battle in a while.
yeah, like I'm gonna have, you know, like a wolf come out of the woods for some excitement and attack them, and like that'll be exciting. Yeah, then you just write it in, and like sometimes looking back, and I remember this. I don't remember if it was something I thought of on my own or if you pointed it out after reading something I'd written. I had some sequence where there's the classic like company traveling through hostile lands and they get attacked by this monster thing and they defeat it and they keep going. And at some point I looked back on that part and I was like, that plays absolutely no role in anything in this story. Like, it's just a random monster that attacks them and they defeat it, and there's no consequence on their journey, on the characters' character arcs, nothing. And I was like, that's probably bad to have something like that in a story that it has no influence on anything. And I mean, that was very early on, and since then I've started to realize more and more how, you know, if you have a very specific story you want to tell, which I think you should, you want to have the intentionality of being like, okay, this is what needs to happen to make this the most impactful. I know you don't like that word. The most impacting
instead of impacting.
Impacting story, you know, and otherwise you're going to write like 2,000 pages because you're going to be rambling all over the place. And it's hard to stay focused unless you have an outline that's saying, you know, like, this is where you're going, this is where you need to get to. And that, you know, that can really direct your focus.
Yeah, and those 2,000 pages are all going to be a display of maybe how well you can write an engaging conversation, but a conversation that's just isolated from the rest of the story.
Yeah.
It's not part of a consistent vision that contributes to this kind of complex. You can just have such complexity. Like Rothfuss talks about, you know, how carefully each word is chosen, and each time you read it, you can just see deeper and deeper and deeper. Each little, you know, frown, each little moment of sadness, each little hint is just part of this very complex tapestry of all these things that are interwoven. And I really don't think you can get that without outlining. I just don't think it's possible. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it even really makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
It seems to me that the entire essence of a complex, you know, thought out, foreshadowing rich story is through this sort of planning, someone that has the vision and the intelligence and the intentionality to think it through at such a detailed level. Now, I think there is a place for inspiration, and I think maybe, you know, our subconscious can know things and connect things and plant these little seeds that we can't consciously think through. But I don't think that can be the approach for just writing out an entire story.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's see, I had a thought that I wanted to say a moment ago when you were talking. Like, yeah, you know, obviously leave some room for a book, you know, a book being, you do want it to be a representation of you as well, you know, and any author is going to put parts of themselves into the book that they're writing, and, you know, some more than others, you know, you can determine kind of how much you want to do that. But if you're having some contemplation, some things you've been pondering, some emotional struggles in a specific time in your life, like, it's not bad just to, like, you know, infuse that somewhat into the book, because that'll make it authentic, you know. If you have some thoughts that are very unique to your life, very human, and you kind of, you know, put some of those into the book, other people are going to be like, wow, this is really, you know, this isn't just some story she pulled off a shelf and wrote down, like, this was coming from her. And, you know, these things you can't always plan out ahead of time. So, like, that's, you know, moments, That's totally the little, like, you know, pieces of introspection. That's totally good. But I think, and maybe some people who are not big advocates of outlining would say, like, oh, you know, I'm portraying it like, you know, real life. I think I used to think that when I was a kid and I was writing, and I was like, this conversation isn't necessarily applicable to anything in the story, but it's happen. Like it would happen. It's real life. Like, people go through their lives and they're not like only talking about the mission at hand, or like they have these little conversations about random things that are interesting, and that's what builds them as characters. I'm like, yeah, like put it in the book. But it's like, if you're going to do that with everything, then your book's going to be really long. It's just like, you know, in a movie, you don't...
You're telling a story.
Yeah, you're telling a story. And how you tell a story is by picking what should be told to tell this specific story. You know, you're not going to have a movie like, you know, you're not going to be watching the movie, you know, Lord of the Rings or any movie, doesn't matter the genre, and have the characters be like, well, you know, I have to go to the bathroom right now. Like, no, like, that's what people would be like, what, you know, that's the 20th time it's happened. Well, they've been on the road for 5 days. Of course, you would go to the bathroom 20 times in 5 days. Like, like, no, you don't, you know,
this is just
that's realistic. You don't need to tell what's realistic. You know, you don't need to tell everything. You tell what contributes to the story.
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting, because it can, you know, obviously that's an extreme example, but it can become hard to see. It can become hard to distinguish exactly, especially for beginning writers. That's why, you know, the more streamlined or more minimalistic, more fast-paced stories seem to start appealing more and more as I grow older. Even though I appreciate poetic prose, even though I appreciate complex, you know, certainly complex complex stories, but even though I appreciate complex style, you know, whatever, elaborate descriptions of the feast or the palace, like I do like appreciate a rich world. I do like a rich religion. I do, but I find myself graduating ever towards more streamlined things where everything is actually contributing to the story, and it can become hard to tell, like, the temple or the religion, the gods, the goddesses, what sort of care this man takes for his armor. These things, you know, it can be like, wow, that's a powerful, rich thing that, you know, is unique to him, is unique to this world. These gods display the metaphorical question, you know, the powers, the metaphorical good versus evil worldviews that are in tension here, and so I should put those in, and it can be hard to tell what's you know, contributing to the story and what's not. So it is a tricky thing.
And because in some moments you might think like, okay, this conversation, this dialogue that I'm writing, it's not like necessarily moving the story forward, but maybe it's revealing something about the character. And like you said, this can be really nebulous territory, because sometimes, you know, you could write endless dialogues revealing stuff about the character, but you can't put them all in the book. You know, there's not enough room for that. But some might be necessary and good, even if it's just some idle conversation. You know, I think as long as the scene has a deliberate, you know, goal in your mind, where you're like, okay, why I put this scene in the book was, you know, for this reason. Even if it's just, you know, like, I mean, even, you know, Rothfuss has scenes with Quoth and his friends just chatting about something, you know, not necessarily something important. But as a reader, like, I enjoyed those scenes because it let me see the dynamic between them. You know, it let me continue to build in my mind the relationship between the friends, because, for example, in that Quoth's friendship with, like, Will and Sim, his two main friends, you spend a lot of time, like, never actually being with them together. You know, he spends a lot of time just referencing them, or, like, you know, like, oh, they're going to the university together, you know, Quoth and Will and Sim, but, you know, they're off doing something else. You're not actually physically with them. And so it's important to sometimes have a scene with the three of them bodily together, even if they're not talking about, like, anything super important, you know?
Right. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Huh. So for you, in your process, going back to kind of how you build your stories, what would you say your process is? Kind of from the ground up, do you start off with an idea and then,
I mean,
Sorry, I had like two questions and I wasn't sure which one I wanted to ask.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's really all tied back to the question number 3 that you outlined in the beginning of like, how I outlined. And I think I start mainly with like the most unique idea of the story that stands out to me of, and maybe it's just something I wrote in my notes, one sentence, about usually character focused, usually not like, oh, I had this idea about the world and the Dark Lord and how it was going to end, usually it's like, oh, what if I had a character who had this family situation, because to me, those are the most interesting things usually is the small, like the character and their relationships with other people. And like, what if I had this dynamic of like, maybe a widow who has a young child, but her child's been taken away because of, she was in debt. Maybe it's, medieval times. And
that's how readers are going to engage with the stories.
Yeah.
Through the lens of the character.
Yeah. And this is what I learned kind of from reading non-fantasy books, like historical fiction, I was kind of surprised to find out like, oh, you can have a super simple story about one person's life. And like, I love this book and I'm way more emotionally engaged in this story than I am about like the fantasy world ending in doom and destruction because, I feel for the character so much. And so when I outline, I usually, start with something like this, like, oh, just like, what if there's a character like this? And that piques my interest. And then usually I kind of start to accumulate ideas from people I talk to, people's lives as, I travel and meet different people and ask them, hear some about their lives. And I encounter more interesting details. I draw a lot of inspiration from history, a lot of documentaries or books that I read about, medieval times, yes, but, you can take any story from history and transplant it into, like writing it into a fantasy book or any book, like we talk about fantasy a lot because that's what we've written a lot, but, it can apply, you can take any story from any time and a lot of the emotions can still apply no matter where you transplant it. So, I start to build the details from a lot of history, a lot of world events and, oh, this is interesting, this is provocative. And eventually I have some rough idea just from, mulling over things for a while of like, okay, yeah, maybe this could happen, maybe this could happen. And just like a very skeletal outline of bullet points.
Yeah, a character and the different powers that are tugging at him.
Yeah.
And what he's wanting, what he's working for.
Yeah, so focused initially on the character. And then, slowly as I get more ideas, I'll fill in a bit of the peripheral context and I'll start to, my bullet point outline will start to expand into like paragraphs of like explaining motives or like, oh yeah, like this side character could come and they're going to, interact in this way and this is going to cause this emotional transformation and, whatever. And start to just slowly build in the more ideas, more context, more outside characters, outside factors, until, my outline has expanded into being, many pages long. Yeah. And then, you reach some point when you have to start working with the logistics of like,
yes,
okay, I got my fun ideas down and now it's like, okay, how is this going to work?
Yeah.
How like you need to make things actually make sense. You need to make sure it's all cohesive and all the parts fit together.
You usually start from a place of looking at his internal motivators and his internal weaknesses and the sort of internal journey that you'd like him to go on, right? The maturity that you would like him to reach, the fear you'd like him to overcome, the power you'd like him to unlock, whatever. Things that are internal. And then you want to make sure that those match with the external world. Is that a good way to describe it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's a combination of, starting...
Or you start with an external world that has...
And how it influences. Yeah.
But then there are still just lots of logistics.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like who killed who and relationships and travel time.
And like, travel time. And okay, what this character, because sometimes when I look back
that's what I meant.
at my initial outlines, I'll be like, oh yeah, like initially I was just throwing ideas out there and I had like this character, killing this character or simply, being aggressive toward them in some way. And like now, farther down the road, now that I have the characters more developed, I realize like that's not really congruent with, how that character A would behave toward character B. Like I can't believe I wrote that in the first outline. Like, what was I thinking, like, and so yeah, there's so much then of having to see what, like, what works together and what's realistic, and trying to not lose sight of the personalities and characters and motives of all the characters, because sometimes, you can be thinking so much along the lines of, this is this character's strengths and weaknesses, and you can follow that vein for a little bit, and then suddenly you'll have a cool idea of a plot item, and be like, oh, then this could happen, and you want to make them work, but you need to pick what's actually gonna flow together, and sometimes you can't just like throw in some cool plot twist if it's not actually in line with their internal story. So yeah, like just getting all the general flow chart down, and then
any examples of dilemmas you've run into where you really wanted, like for me it was these sci-fi book, my sci-fi novel I'm working on. These characters are on a ship, and I wanted a certain hostage situation to take place where one of them is a little bit freaked out. He's worried about basically the ship's computer system overseeing things with too much power, being sort of totalitarian. He doesn't trust it. He takes a prisoner. I wanted him to take a hostage, and certain things to unfold in such a way that certain through the course of this hostage situation, certain parts of the ship were destroyed or whatever, resulting in less supplies or a malfunctioning computer system or a death. So certain things like this, and then I realized, like, wait. But with how I have the system right now, with how I have the ship right now, the computer system would be so powerful that this hostage situation could never transpire how I designed it, and things like that. Like that would be an example I could go into. But do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot. It's been a while since I was doing a lot of outlining, because I've moved on past that stage for the most part. So I don't remember a lot in detail, but I mean, I remember some things I had to figure out. A lot of things I had to figure out as far as the pacing of the novel, because for instance, I had one scene where it was like some of the characters were imprisoned and awaiting trial, and there's supposed to be an escape, and initially it was during this escape that I had written in a reveal for the identity of one of the characters, who was always kind of a mystery to the main character. Okay. And that was my plan for a long time when I was outlining the book. It's like, okay, this escape's going to happen. And why I was so attached to this reveal happening now was because it was one of the very first scenes I envisioned, was like, oh yeah, like I can have, there's going to be this escape, and they're going to, be discovered, and they're going to be fleeing from the guards, and they're going to be forced to like go through the room where, I'm not going to say specifically so I won't spoil anything, but they're going to go through a room where there's a character who knows the identity of this mysterious character, and they're going to call them out. And that's going to be like the first time that both my POV character and my audience knows and like figures out who this mysterious character is. Yeah, who the mysterious guy is that my protagonist has been traveling with for quite a while. And it's plus a lot more emotionally charged if you knew who all the characters were, but I don't want to spoil anything. Right. And I had this scene in my mind from the beginning of like, yes, like this is gonna be such a good scene, and I was so attached to it that it took me quite a while of going through my outline multiple times before I realized this is a terrible place for this reveal to happen. Like, this takes place maybe 30% of the way through the book. And I should not have the reveal take place 30%. Like, the reveal is supposed to be kind of a climactic thing at the end of the book.
Right.
You know, at least like maybe the end of the second act. And like, what am I doing having it here? Like, that will mess up so much of the suspense that is the whole point of the book. And but of course, you know, you're attached to it, so you're like, no, like, I don't want to let it go. I like that scene, and like, but really, you know, the story, the cohesion of the story is more important than like one cool scene you thought of.
And so painful.
Yeah, and like, you know, you will always think of another good scene, you know, like, you know, I rewrote it, I moved that so that it happens at the end of the second act, and the escape still happens. It just, the reveal doesn't happen in the escape. The reveal happens later now, and it's way better for the story overall, you know?
Okay.
And that's what outlining can do for you. You know, if I hadn't outlined anything, I probably would have just jumped in and started writing it, and I would have written the reveal happening with the escape. And then, like, I would have finished the book and looked back and be like this whole thing is messed up because I did that.
And now, and now, like, you still have to work through so much. You still have to think so much. You still have to research. You still have to calculate travel dates and times and logistics. But it's all during this very streamlined bullet point process. And then once you actually get into the tedious, time-consuming job of the actual prose, the actual manuscript, you hope that you have a very, very, very small fraction of stuff you're going to need to realize and...
I mean, you hope, and I think what you discover a lot as you actually get into the writing is like, you start to see how things are actually going to flesh out, and you will realize a lot of things that you need to change, you know, you will realize, but you're going to be a lot farther along the process of writing a coherent novel than you would be if you just like jumped into writing chapter 1 when you had a cool idea and you don't know anything else about the story.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So do you, from there, how do you do it? Do you aim for generally a scene by scene outline? Earlier you said you want each scene to have purpose and be moving the story forward. That's definitely something I've come to embrace. I want every scene. I struggle with being over detailed, over tedious sometimes. So I've definitely come to focus on every single scene. I want it to have a purpose. Every bit of dialogue. You know, maybe there can be some lines that are just to characterize and are just naturally what would have been said in that moment. But generally, every conversation needs to have a purpose. So would you say you go for that, or is it a little more scaled back? Like, is it more like every chapter, or you have like the story blows, they need to go here, they need to meet this person, they need to... Yeah. But not every scene? How would you say?
Yeah, I'd say... I don't do every scene in detail. Okay. And, you know, I'm not necessarily saying... this is the best way to do it. I'm still trying to find what is the best way for me to write. Yeah. But, you know, I have my long outline that is just everything. Like, you know, the plot plus the story plus, you know, what the characters are thinking, their motives, everything. Like, you know, 150-page document of all of this. And then...
And that's just one continuous document. You don't divide it up. You don't have, like...
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I just have one continuous document. Then I take like the first, you know, 25% of that, copy and paste it onto a separate document. And then I look at it more in detail, you know, narrow my focus onto that and be like, okay, you know, this is the first like quarter of my book. And from there, I usually will, you know, I'll read the first few pages of my outline, you know, be like, okay, yeah, this is what I was thinking for the beginning. These are all the emotions I need to capture. And then on a separate document, I will usually, you know, paraphrase the longer outline that I did into like, this is what actually needs to happen, you know? Okay. So in this chapter, you know, kind of chapter by chapter, in this chapter, I need to, you know, talk about, you know, this thing from their past, because that's important. I need to develop their relationship with their father. I need to drop a few details about this to foreshadow, you know, something for later. I need the character to go here, and, you know, I'll kind of do what needs to happen blow by blow. I don't necessarily outline like first this scene, conversation with character B, then this scene, going to the marketplace, then this scene, like, you know, encountering whatever. I don't really do that. Sometimes I do in my head, kind of, trying to figure out, you know, what the best way to do it is.
Yeah.
And sometimes I feel like it would definitely be helpful to be very intentional because, you know, even with what I just described of kind of writing down like, okay, this is what needs to happen in this chapter, blow by blow. Sometimes I still get distracted. Like even today when I was writing, I wrote, you know, a kind of a character coming home to an like ambivalent reception by his family scene. And then I, you know, I knew what else I needed to convey in that chapter, but I didn't know exactly how to convey it. And I found myself writing a scene that, you know, half a page into it, I reflected, you know, I don't, like, why am I writing this scene? I don't have necessarily a plan for this scene. I don't know if this scene has any use. Like, I don't know if there's anything contributory to the story that I can put in this scene. And I just stopped writing right there because I'm like, wait, like, what am I doing? You know, I kind of just got sidetracked, kind of was, you know, distracted in my mind, didn't know where to go. So I kind of went in this one direction and I don't think it's good, you know? So tomorrow when I start writing again, I'm just going to delete all of that and go in a more intentional direction.
Yeah.
So, you know, sometimes I feel like, you know, it's helpful to do scene by scene. It's helpful to think it through. It can just be difficult in moments to know exactly. Sometimes it's easier when you look back at something that you've written to be like, now I see what I need to do. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. That's fairly similar to what I do. I think, I mean, obviously similar to you, I grew up with a much more, you know, I don't need to outline just because I was younger. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have an actual strong vision for my story. I was more taken up by the cool moments I would envision or the cool characters. And I did have general ideas like, okay, ultimately they're going to travel around here. He's going to go to this training. He's going to train and then he's going to get stuck in the desert and that's going to be cool because they're going to find this. So I did have like this loose thing, but it was very much just what I had been struck with in various moments of inspiration and nothing else. So then when I was actually writing, it'd just be like, okay, they need to get over there somehow. Well, they're traveling here now, so they'll probably have some hard times in the cold and then... And so anyway, similar to you, or I don't know how similar, but I've definitely shifted to now experiment with I would say the other extreme, which is I'm very much intensely focused on outlining. Like I said, I've pretty much wanted every scene, every conversation to have a purpose and a momentum. My actual outline is fairly scene by scene, not absolutely, but I'll do similar to what you said, where actually I just started doing this recently. I started out with the outline, did tons of research. I would try to make it as concise as possible, like what did I say, like bullet point list or flow chart or something. It was just like event. But of course I want to make notes on like, he has to experience this, he has to develop this is what we drop a hint about. So it always becomes
because you need to explain to yourself, because otherwise by the time you're done writing a 150-page outline, if you go back to page 15, like you're not going to remember why what was I thinking specifically about the character's motives in this moment.
Exactly. So I start linking, so you start linking other documents. Okay, I'll make a page for each character. Okay, I'll make a page for each relationship, and it becomes this huge, great but complex, bloated could be the negative word, depending, thing. And so similar to you, perhaps, I end up, when I go back, when I try to take a step back and do the scene by scene outline with a vision for the overall story, I end up doing similar to what you said, each section or each chapter or scene or whatever. Okay, and I have like needs to happen, and then I'll do the list, and then it'll be like, I forget what I have, but like other notes, like, okay, when this needs to happen, it's because of this. When this needs to happen, it's because of this. When this needs to... So those are potential foreshadowings that you can put in. And then questions or uncertainties. So I'll have like these three things. It's like needs to happen, questions and doubts. And then after that, if I feel like I want more specifics, I'll go into the actual scene, like, and conversations. But that could be enough for that chapter, that section is just what needs to happen, my thoughts, my doubts. So that might be similar to kind of what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe you do it a little more detailed.
Probably.
I've been very strongly considering doing it a bit more detailed just because I really want to avoid the weakness of rambling at all, you know, including any extraneous scenes that are, or even making a scene longer than it needs to be, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes I look back on chapters I've written, I'm like, wow, like, you know, that chapter is kind of long because I conveyed something in you know, very present time that maybe could have been summarized, you know, and with the same effectiveness, and keep the story moving a little faster because, you know, maybe I didn't need to say, you know, the details about the weather and whatever, even if I said it in a really interesting way and a really applicable way, you know, maybe they didn't even need to stop in that town. Maybe, you know, maybe this 2 weeks of travel could be told in one paragraph, you know. And that's kind of the intentionality you can get when you outline and you realize, like, this is the only thing I'm trying to say in this chapter. Right. Like, don't say anything else.
Right. And it can be amazing how, you know, we always say just the reader doesn't notice what's not there.
Yeah.
The reader just, you know, that's the story, that's what's before them, so they love it. And, you know, if you come out the far end of a book and you're like, you know, I felt like this so strongly with Kaladin and Shallan and Oathbringer. It was so irritating to me. I'm glad she chose Adolin in the end of Rhythm of War. I think, you know, her journey has been good. That's one of the reasons I actually liked Rhythm of War more than Oathbringer, despite both just being kind of disappointing to me. Was that, okay, Shallan reached some sort of, you know, she reached some sort of closure with this whole fragmented personality thing. She has matured. She's reached this kind of milestone with Adolin. She's ready to commit. These things I was happy for, but I just felt like, you know, coming out of Oathbringer and Rhythm of War, I guess, towards the beginning, you know, once they just became more isolated, I was just like, Shallan and Kaladin just have done nothing. Like, the pinnacle for me, the climax of their relationship was the very first meeting.
Yeah.
The very first, or not really meeting, but like spark conversation during the high storm.
Yeah.
It's like, so you can look back at a book and you can feel like, okay, that character was flat. That character didn't resonate with me. But especially for probably writers like us who have such a focus on characters and the internal story, the internal workings, you know, internally motivated plots, and especially for just, and probably for readers in general, their characters are created by them, their worlds are created by them. They are almost always going to want to give probably more than the reader needs and then is necessary for the story. And I think, it's just important to keep in mind the reader never notices what's not there. He or she's going to read the story, enjoy boom, 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 being moved forwards to the next important event, and that's what they're going to remember as the story. They're not caring that you're leaving out, you know, the town, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble thinking of a good example, but I think we've probably said enough.
Yeah, I think we both understand. Let's see, should we kind of skipped past the second question that you mentioned at the beginning.
That's okay. I think we're probably in a pretty good flow here at talking about your outlining.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more we can say, definitely. I didn't want to forget if you wanted to go back to that.
That was how the cultures change with regards to prose and. No, I think we're going good here because, unless you feel like you've already talked.
No, I mean, there's more. Outlining. There's more we could say. Definitely.
There's definitely more. I mean. Is there anything further you'd want to say about your specific outlining process? What do you do once you go through that step of, you know, taking this section and condensing it? And, oh, by the way, I think I remembered. I did have 3 sections when I started out. What needs to happen, and then this needs to happen, why, because of the internal character, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then the doubts I had. And I realized they were kind of redundant. So I remember now I have just 2, just what needs to happen. And I explain everything, the whys and everything there. And then I have the doubts. And it can get a little long, but you know,
Everything gets long
Yeah.
eventually.
everything gets long eventually.
Even like, yeah, I mean, I have
Pretty
so
soon
many.
you've just written the book in your outline.
I know, like, whenever I tell people, sometimes people ask me, like, oh, they know I'm writing a book. How's your book going? And I'll be like, oh, yeah, like, I finished outlining it, like, 6 months ago. And, like, I outlined quite thoroughly, something like 800 pages.
me
And
too.
they're like, wait, like, what? Like,
wait,
if
so
the
the book's gonna
outline
be,
is
like,
800
8,000?
pages, then, yeah, then what's the book going to be?
Yeah.
And I always try to explain, just like,
That was
like,
actually my
I have
next
to explain it all to myself so that I
Yeah.
don't forget it. Sometimes it takes longer in the outline than in the actual book for
Yeah.
a scene, because maybe in the outline you have to write like all the nuances of this is what I'm thinking for like why she does this, and in the book all you do is write what she does.
Yeah. And it can be strange, but after consideration, you realize it makes sense.
Yeah. And so, yeah, my outline's 800 pages. That doesn't mean the book's going to be 8,000,
Right.
even though, probably the rough draft will be too long. But let's see, what was I saying? I was saying,
Yeah. Sorry.
when people ask me, oh, how's it going? And I talk about all that I've outlined, and it's a lot of motives. You really have to think into the characters and the motives, and I always try to come up with, like we were saying, different documents to like, okay, like, oh, I need to simplify this for myself. And I have multiple documents, like, okay, this is the skeleton outline, where like I try to like, okay, simplify like one line, like boom boom boom, these are the main events of the book. And even those documents eventually, like, I'm adding in subtext or like parentheses of like
this.
like maybe this like depends on what I think about like blah blah blah.
Okay,
and
right.
like
Yeah,
then
me
I'll be
too,
like,
totally.
oh, like, no, this isn't working, I need a new method of like, okay, let's try trying to simplify it
for this dilemma.
yeah
alone.
exactly, because sometimes obviously the long verbose explaining everything is fully necessary, but sometimes if you need to wrap your mind around certain, like, the pacing of
You
the
need to
story,
be able to
maybe
see it all.
you need to just look at one
totally.
page and see, these are the main events.
Totally.
And so, yeah, I mean, I have all sorts of different documents. I have color coded, like, within my main document, I have, okay, blue means, it's a possibility, but I'm going to put, 3 paragraphs and I'm going to have to only choose one, they're just options. Blue means option. Green means, my latest editions. Purple means my latest editions. Pink is going to be, I'm going to put pink for any time I foreshadow this. I'm going to put, red for any questions I still have. I'm going to put, and so the whole document turns into this very dynamic, rainbow of different meanings that only I know. And it's, if I leave the document for too long and, go on a road trip for a couple months, then by the time I come back, I'm like, oh, like, what does purple mean? Because I don't remember.
Yeah. Do you have a specific program you use or a specific software that you found?
I just work in Pages.
Okay.
On my laptop. Just word processing. Probably there's a better one, but at this point, it's like I have hundreds of pages of outlining organized on there, and it works fine for me. But I know you use Wiki.
Wiki, yeah.
Yeah.
Wiki, I guess Wiki's probably the American way to say it. Yeah, no, I've experimented with some things. Some of my clients one in particular has actually introduced me to like several different programs and apps that he likes, and I've found them definitely beneficial. I wouldn't use them as much as he or many other people would. I think it can actually get kind of counterproductive, especially if you have too many. But I think it's dangerous. I think it's a dangerous trap, this temptation to organize everything endlessly and like have everything become this aesthetic, like almost like you're creating like an encyclopedia for your world. This is something people can fall into. People who the classic just like world building and never actually get to writing.
Yeah.
But I do. I have found several interesting to experiment with. I've settled on a fairly simple system. I've been kind of frustrated. There seem to be a lot of apps you have to pay for. You know, I wanted something that you can link in between. You can link various documents and pages to one another, and then you have like that's very key. So you're reading the overall outline, and it's like, okay, Billy's romance with Anastasia, and so you're reading, and you're like, this chapter they're gonna have the first sparks of love. They're gonna have this conversation, and it's kind of tense because he's part of this faction and she's part of this faction, and they're these different warring political parties, and so they're gonna talk about this, and there's just gonna be this final comment she makes that shows opens this little window into her personality that piques his interest, and so I'll be writing the chapter and then I'll move on, but there it'll be like piques his interest, and I want to be able to highlight it, and I want to be able to go to another document where I talk about why this element of her personality is significant, how it'll develop in the future. I need to mention all the foreshadowing little quirks or whatever emotions or tones that throughout the beginning stages of the relationship should foreshadow things in the future. So then I want to document on their relationship, and I want to be able to link it. I want the search function to be good. But these are fairly simple things, And after a while, I found that, so I've been using a wiki, which I have my own website, which is not launched yet, but I have a bunch of different, whatever they're called, widgets running on there, and one of them is this wiki, which is definitely nice because I can link things, I can add quotes, I can add video, I can add maps, I can add, and then I can link to websites, I can link to other pages on the wiki. It has the website search function, so that's what I use. But in the end, it's fairly similar to a Pages document, to just a long document. I was gonna ask you how you find it tends to evolve, after that long, big, continuous document, because I end up having, like I said, a lot of things for each relationship and each character. I have the condensed sort of flow chart or like bullet pointed list if I can. Then I have the longer one for each section, and then I find myself going into history. Okay, there's a huge document on history, and then there's the same sort of fragmented documents on each element in history. How have these political parties evolved? How has this technology evolved? Then it's of course technology research pages, links to outside videos, YouTubes. How does this technology affect society at large? Oh, right, I have to think about society at large. So then I'll have one on culture, how, nanotech, AI, 3D printing, how have these affected culture? Do people still have children? What's their mentality about children? What's the mentality about family? What's the mentality about, simulation versus real world experience?
Yeah.
And all of these, I want to kind of integrate all of these into the dialogue and just the overall worldview of my characters very organically. So I don't want them to use metaphors or figures of speech that would be weird today or in those days that are normal today. And I want them to use metaphors or figures of speech that we haven't thought of yet.
Yeah.
So let's see. Was I going to go anywhere else?
Well, you were asking me like how my outlining evolved past that like long document stage.
Super briefly. So I was kind of expanding on all of that to say like those are what it turns into for me. Things I need to research, cultures, blah blah blah, and how they are for you. I have found like a few map making things. A few timeline softwares or whatever that I've found nice because I can look at it and see like, okay, these characters are here, these characters are here, these characters are here. Now, I can look at it and kind of try to notice things that are missing or notice where certain foreshadowings might be best timed. Let's see. Anything else? There was something else I was going to mention.
Maps, timelines, other documents, society.
Oh, I don't know. Family trees.
Yeah,
I have like an occasional like keynote presentation with a family tree or something. No, I think that's about it. The wiki's been great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't used any specific software for, maps or timelines. my maps, I still prefer to hand draw them just because I like that.
Okay.
You can make them on the computer, but I don't know, I don't tend to enjoy that as much.
Right.
Timelines, I just make, word, on word processing.
Right.
But I honestly haven't made those for quite a while. Let's see, what was it gonna say? Yeah, like I do expand, eventually as you get into a story, it's inevitable that you're going to expand into like, oh, I need to know about the religion. I need to know. I think I divide initially, I organize it into I have a folder for the story itself,
Okay.
which is like, anything, my actual chapters, my actual writing. I have a folder for my outlining, which is kind of like the plot, all my, myriad skeletons and flowcharts and those documents. And then I have a folder for the setting where I put, okay, here's about the culture. These are kind of, you were talking about the metaphors they would use, figures of speech, these are things that they're going to reference, these are customs, these are the meanings of different clothing, different colors, different everything, the culture. I have family trees in there. I have, the religion, a document about the religion and how it developed and how it interacts with society. I have a document about the history, simply explaining the history, document for languages, and a lot of document for superstitions that people hold, document for, a lot of things. That just going all into the settings folder, like this is the setting, this is everything about it. And then, in the outlining folder, there'd be, specific documents for this character's motives, this villain's motives, this, the protagonist and the evolution of, her magic or whatever, if it's fantasy. And so many specific things, I have a document for, most of my main characters, just kind of describing who they are, their motives, little details about them, things about their personality. It kind of just, breaks down farther and farther. And as you realize, you need to explain, you need to remember and have on call all the details about like, and then I have probably like 5 different documents that are titled either like add in, like add this in, or memos or this or that. And it's basically, like, oh, here's a detail. I need to go back and mention that, or just like, remember that I mentioned, on page 37, I mentioned this character, and I need to mention them again at some point, but I'm probably going to forget. So, documents like just that are to help me remember everything.
Yeah. How often when you sit down to actually write, how do you find you refer back to the outline? Do you generally have it so thoroughly or so completely in your mind at that point, chapter by chapter, that you pretty much just look at the outline for that chapter and then leave it, and then like you go back and check, maybe later when your mind's fresh, and check to the add in and weave in whatever you need to, and check the character specific relational whatever foreshadowing documents and weave in whatever you need to? Or do you find that you kind of review everything relevant to that chapter, characters and everything, before you write? How, like, is it a pretty tedious or lengthy process going through the outline before each chapter, or do you find that at that point you have what you need?
I think usually I have what I need to start. And then usually anything that I need to add in, I will usually go back and add in. Like if I read on like, add in or like memos or something, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I need to do that. Usually I'll go back because then I can have a perspective of what I've already written and see like, oh, maybe I can weave it in here. Plus, it's hard to keep track of everything in every moment. It'd be like, and know everything. It's kind of, write what you know, and then you're always going to go back and change things.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, same. I think the same for me. It's always, that's another thing we could talk about. It's always nice and comforting to know how much you can change the story drastically through editing.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we've definitely, both of us, certainly me, been trying to appreciate more, or kind of integrate into our style more, is the knowledge that, especially if you can err on the side of leaving stuff out, err on the side of being streamlined, it's always going to be obvious going back where you should add stuff in. And if you do too much, then it's always going to be painful cutting stuff out.
Yeah.
But also hugely beneficial. Cutting stuff out, you can cut stuff out and reread it and be like, wow, it's so much more full of momentum, so much more engaging, so much less ponderous, whatever. So, yeah, how have you would you say let's see, what's the best way? People talk about like compulsive editors and compulsive writers. I've heard, I think was it Brandon Sanderson talking about that?
I'm not
Or
sure.
Patrick Rothfuss, which if it's truly, if there are people who truly find themselves enjoying what would you say regarding writing versus editing? What do you find more pleasurable? What would you say regarding the dramatic changes you can do while editing?
Yeah.
The vision you can come back with? I guess that's a good place to start.
I don't know. Like, for me, I think I'm more of a compulsive writer than editor. I enjoy editing, but I think it's always, both are difficult because both you're trying to figure out, what to put and like how to best orchestrate a scene. Editing in some ways can be easier because you already have what's there in front of you, and like you said, sometimes it's more obvious going back, like, this needs to change. Whereas writing, you're just going forward kind of blind in a sense. But my weakness typically has been to enjoy writing too much, where I always want to write. I don't want to edit. I don't even want to outline. I just want to keep writing. I just kind of want to keep writing.
I'm definitely, I would say, I understand what that feels like, but it's definitely sometimes tricky or sometimes difficult for me to get in the zone or the flow where I'm really enjoying writing. It happens totally, but if I don't have this process of research and outlining and editing, those are very invigorating to me because I see the vision and I feel very confident.
Yeah.
Like, okay, this is going somewhere. Writing, I don't like to say it's hit and miss, because I'm trying to structure my life to the point where it's not hit and miss. But it can be hit and miss where I just feel like, oh, this isn't going anywhere. I don't know if this is achieving anything.
Yeah. And I understand that too. Like, because I can identify with a lot of times in outlining, at least, maybe, I don't know so much editing for me, but outlining and the planning, I can feel like, wow, like I'm making so much progress. I'm like, the story's coming together. I can see it shaping up. And then, definitely when I go to write, sometimes I spend a lot of time just like, oh, I'm not sure exactly, how to approach this. And yeah, there'll be moments when I get in like the flow, and it's coming so naturally. And then there's moments when it's just like, maybe I'm writing fine, but I don't necessarily know that I'm writing what should be written.
But you enjoy it. You tend to enjoy it at least much more than editing. You find you enjoy writing more of the time.
Probably. I think with both it's on and off. Like, sometimes I love writing. Other times it's just really painful if I'm not getting in the flow. Sometimes editing, it's, I'll read something and be like, oh, I know exactly what to add here. It's really good. Other times I'll read something and I'll be like, this is missing something, but I don't know what to do with it.
Huh, that's interesting. I think I would say I just pretty much always enjoy editing. It's just, it's comforting because I come back and oftentimes it's like, okay, this is better than I thought. Like, it just is intimidating. Sometimes you feel like your writing can just be so bad.
Yeah.
You're familiar, of course, each artist is intimately familiar with all the flaws of their own work. Sometimes I can come back and freak out if it's particularly bad, but I always feel like, okay, I see the vision. Okay, this can go there. And I always feel like it's faster. You feel like you cover ground more. You feel like relieved that it's not tedious because it took so long to write, but you're reading it and it passes more quickly.
It reads so quickly.
Yeah. You see all the little instances where you need to maybe add a little bit about his, a little thought about his brother there. Oh, that'd be perfect. You see all those little instances. So that's interesting because I definitely enjoy that quite a bit, I would say. What do you do when you find yourself struggling to get in the flow? First of all, how often does that happen, and have you noticed any patterns? How do you try to structure your life or whatever?
Yeah.
And then what do you do when that happens?
Yeah, well, usually if I'm having a hard time, usually I go to one of my favorite books and I read just a couple pages because sometimes that gets me in the flow, and I'll be like, oh yeah, like, this is how those sentences should flow, and this is how, the story should be paced and everything. That can be dangerous too, though, because a lot of times you will find yourself, if you read a book and then go directly to writing, you will find yourself mimicking the author's style without meaning to,
That's
which,
true.
Of course you want to pick up the elements that you like of the author's style, but, I don't want to write just like Patrick Rothfuss. Like, you need your own style, you need your own voice. And if you do that too much, it can make the tone of your story inconsistent because like maybe in this moment, and this is a problem I have sometimes, is like I'll read, some of The Name of the Wind, and then just for like fun, inspiration, and I'll be like, okay, put it aside, I'm going to write. And then the next few pages will sound kind of like Patrick Rothfuss style.
Yeah.
And then maybe, I leave it and I come back the next day, and today I'm reading like a different author. Maybe I'm reading A Thousand Splendid Suns, or maybe I'm reading Wolf Hall, by Hilary Mandel, and then my tone will be like that.
Yeah.
And you can't have it. You can't go from Patrick Rothfuss to Colette Husseini. Like, you need some consistency, and you can't let your tone be flavored too much by what you read. So you need to be careful if you're out of flow and you turn to one of your favorite novels to get you back in flow. You need to be careful of that.
Right.
Sometimes just taking a break, clearing your head. You always, at least for me, I have a designated part of my day where it's like, okay, this is when I'm writing. And sometimes I'll be in the middle of my designated writing time and just like not flowing at all. But I feel like, this is my time, I need to keep writing. I need to get in the flow. And then you'll waste an hour just like kind of writing something not really that good. And you look back and like, I should have gotten up, done something else, like come back, in the evening or something.
Yeah, definitely. That's tough for me. First of all, I do tend to struggle sometimes with discipline or structuring my days. So when I do have some time where I've dedicated to sit down, whether it's structured or unstructured, when I do finally sit down to write, sometimes I can feel all this pressure because it's like, man, Jesse, you need to do this more. You need to structure this into your life more. If you're not feeling it now, you better figure it out, because it's mental. You've had a break. You haven't been doing it. You're not whatever. So that can be tough. But there is a, I think, justification for if inspiration is not coming in the moment, it's not coming. And maybe you don't know why it is. Maybe you do. But regardless, it's not coming.
You can't force it. Yeah.
Maybe you'll have to structure better next week your life, and maybe it'll be a bump-free week. But for now, you can't write when you're having those the slowness of thought and everything. So what do you do in just your general schedule? What do you do? What have you found is best for writing with a clear mind? Do you write morning, evening, exercise, food, sleep, all that stuff?
What I do is not necessarily what's best, because obviously it's also influenced by what else is going on in your life. And like right now, I write in the morning, first thing when I get up, because that's when the house is quiet. But preferably I would pick the evenings, because I think I write better in the evenings. Maybe because my body's more tired at that point, but my mind is still awake. And sometimes in the morning I can start to feel restless. If I get up
you have stuff to do.
and I get up and then I directly sit down for a few hours, and eventually my body's like antsy, wants to move, and that makes it hard to focus. So evening would be better, but sometimes in the evening it's hard to get quiet time to do that. Also, after exercise is good. Also something I don't really do, because once again, like, the morning is the quiet time, so I kind of take my writing time in the morning. But exercise obviously just gets your blood flowing.
Yeah,
It gets
definitely. It's
it
so
gets the
noticeable.
energy out of your body, and it lets
Yeah.
your mind focus. And
It's
you can,
amazing to me,
yeah, it can be
dramatic.
remarkable how much better,
Yeah.
like, I write after exercising.
Yeah. Okay. So right now, morning, because of external factors, people are up pretty soon, and then you exercise later in the day with them, and evenings full of family and whatever, cooking and just other stuff. You probably, well, you haven't been freelancing much these days.
Not that
but
much, just a little bit, yeah.
You probably like to, if you do, you probably like to get your own writing done first.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, and I assume it's like this for you, for most people. You know, you only
for the
have
whole evening thing being inspiration.
Yeah, but I mean, you only have a limited amount of time each day that you can spend on the computer focused.
Yeah.
You know, if you freelance writing a book for someone else for, even 2 hours, then if you try to go to your own stuff, you're already tired of being on the computer.
Yeah.
You're already like tired of sitting, you want to move, your eyes are tired of the screen, and that's going to make you not write as well. So, yeah, I always do my own stuff first, and then usually get up, exercise, do whatever else is in my day, and then in the evening maybe sit down and do some freelancing.
So, if you were once COVID or whatever all blows over and you're out there alone, your plan would probably be to schedule in writing in the evening.
Yeah, I would definitely do that.
It's social, huh? The world is so social in the evening.
Yeah, and that's why it depends so much on other things, other people. But if I can, I will do it in the evening, yeah. And the morning, I would rather wake up in the morning and go explore. If I'm in some new country, I'd wake up, go explore, have my day, be active, come back in the evening, very satisfied with my day, all my physical energy out, and then I can apply my mind. Yeah.
So with your traveling lifestyle, being overseas so much and exploring and having this entirely other focus of adventure and language and culture, whatever, how have you balanced the two, and are you anticipating a need to sacrifice one in order to prioritize the other? Like for me personally, I'm planning on moving a bit more slowly, getting a bit more settled to devote time more fully to my projects. I've been traveling for however many years now, and pretty much I've just I was going to say I haven't written, but that's not true. I mean, aside from the freelancing, the last year and a half, well, it's quite a while, year and a half has been devoting more time to my book. And a significant time to my book, and a good portion of that was traveling. But before that, it was pretty much I was just book was on the back burner, didn't give it much attention at all, and was just traveling. So are you anticipating, and what are you anticipating there as far as?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen from the traveling I've done, I've realized that you're always optimistic going into it. Like I'll be able to travel. No, I am too. Like, I'll be in. I mean, we were in Turkey together for a month, and we're like, oh yeah, we'll go and we can explore during the day. Then we can come back to the hostel and write in the evenings. And whether it's just traveling like that, or whether it's volunteering, doing like work away or something where you give maybe 5 hours of work to your host, and you're like, 5 hours of work, yeah, that's good. Then I can, write. I'll still have time to write, or house sitting, or no matter what you're doing, you're always optimistic that you'll have time to write. And generally, we've both found that it's more difficult, because traveling is it's unpredictable. Like, you're always moving. You're always needing to figure things out. Like, where are you staying, and what language is this, and where do I buy food, and what's the transportation, and that takes so much time, And then simple things of trying to meet people and have social, the fun things, exploring, traveling. That can make it unpredictable. You don't know when you're going to get time. And even if you're in one location, say like volunteering, and you're like, oh, like I only have 5 hours of work that I have to do for my host, and then I have a lot of free time, right? But like, no, not really, because it takes time to eat meals and socialize with your host and do the random other things that you do when you're traveling, like they end up being great adventures. Like, oh, we want to go like to these hot springs up the mountain, like let's go ride the horses to the hot springs, and you're doing that stuff, and so you don't always have the time that you expect to write. So Plus, maybe you're freelancing on top of it. So yeah, looking to the future, I definitely am thinking, okay, travel slowly enough where I can put time toward my own book. If normally I would cover this much ground in 4 days or 5 days, maybe cover it in 7 days instead, so that I can allocate a bit more time to writing.
Yeah. But you are still planning on going kind of fast, at least at the beginning?
I don't know. That's a good question. I've told myself maybe no more volunteering for a while. Let me focus on my book. Because volunteering is super fun, but pretty much I've seen that you don't get that much time for your own stuff. And then I'm just trying to think, if I can be very intentional about it, maybe I can still travel, staying in hostels, and just not travel as quickly, like instead of like we did in Turkey, we stayed in each place maybe 3 nights on average. Maybe stay just 5 nights in each place instead. And yeah, so a bit slower.
Huh. I guess you've traveled a good bit less than me, huh? I'm just wondering, you've always been a bit more disciplined in writing and being able to sit down and make more progress. I have been largely happy in the past years to try prioritize the things I prioritize, social and lots of spontaneity and generally, leaving my book to the side for the moment. But looking back, it's like, I could have prioritized it more. And now I definitely feel ready. I feel this pressure, like, okay, it's been long enough. I'm ready.
Yeah.
I have the maturity and the vision, at least to get something out there. I'm hoping I'll grow as the years go on, but also hoping that it's ready to offer something of value. So I'm definitely ready to, 6 months in one spot. Also, the social, I guess I've been going for a bit longer, so I've missed like the stable, consistent friends. And that would be a question, is how important have you found social, the balance, how do you balance, what's the ideal amount of time for you to write each day? And then if you have to freelance, how do you factor that in? And then what's the ideal amount of social time, solo time?
Well, I think they're all very important. Social time, social interaction is very important.
Yeah, it's huge.
That's like something during COVID, I felt a little stifled because
that's something I've been learning too.
Yeah, like I wasn't...
Even beyond COVID. Sorry.
Yeah. I wasn't getting out. I wasn't spending time with friends. I was at home so much of the time. And initially I was like, this is great. I can write. I have nothing else to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, it has been great in a lot of ways. But eventually you start to feel like, okay, I need stimulus.
Yeah,
I need inspiration. I can't just sit at home all the time. So social is very important. Having, not only meeting new people, but being able to be with friends. And, for me, you were asking about my travel plans in the future. For me, it depends a lot on what my friends are doing, if you're going to go somewhere and going to go to South America and rent a place for 6 months and work on your book, then I'd be like, okay, sure. Like I'll stay in one place for 6 months. Yeah. If, but maybe a friend of mine is like, hey, want to go, travel more quickly, Eastern Europe or something, I'll say, sure, and so it's not necessarily like I have a set plan, because it's so valuable to me to see like who the people I want to spend time with and what they're doing. Yeah. And
you're not so dependent on or looking for the stability, permanence of location.
Yeah, not necessarily. Like as long as and I've said this to friends before when we've been like, hey, what about this trip? I've been like, okay, yes, but maybe we're going to go slower. Maybe, can we spend, every few days, can we go to a cafe or something? Maybe we're camping for a month. Can we go to, on our way, stop by a cafe for a couple hours so I can write? Yeah. Can we, maybe stay in a motel once a week so I can, making room for my writing, because I don't want to sacrifice it entirely, because that's what I did that for a few years, kind of in the end of high school and then post high school for a couple years. I was like in transition between two stories. I didn't know exactly where to go. I was busy with school. I was busy then with work and establishing myself as a freelancer for a few years. And I really didn't do anything on my book. And then I started to travel. We were traveling together for a while, and I still didn't do anything on my book because traveling's busy. And then eventually I look back and I'm like, man, like the years are passing, you know? Yeah, I've been doing great things, but like my book needs to be a priority.
Right.
So I definitely have that now of like, no matter what I do, whether I'm, you know, in Thailand for 6 months renting a place, or whether I'm traveling, you know, across the east coast of the US or in Europe, I will always want to be intentional about making some room to continue my book and to not, you know, you can never let too big of a gap pass, because if you do, then you'll get out of it, you know, you'll get out of the flow, you'll come back and forget things, and that's not helpful.
Totally.